Golden Retriever saves three dying bear cubs. What happens 2 years later is incredible. The ringing phone shattered the quiet of John Harrison's cabin, cutting through the soft crackling of the fireplace. He set down his worn coffee mug, rubbing his tired eyes before answering. "John here." "John, it's Wilson Wildlife Reserve," a voice came, urgent and strained. "We've got a situation. Three bear cubs, orphans. Their mother's gone. We don't know if she was poached or just lost. The cubs won't make it through the night without help. We need you." John exhaled, already moving toward the door. "I'll be there in an hour." He grabbed his thick jacket, his boots crunching against the wooden floor as he moved with the urgency of someone who had seen too many of these cases before. Wilson Reserve wasn't just any sanctuary. It was one of the few places in the region dedicated to rehabilitating wildlife for reintroduction. And now, three helpless cubs were fighting for their lives. At his feet, Bella, his golden retriever, lifted her head, sensing the shift in his energy. She had been with him for 6 years, through rescues, long nights in the wild, and moments where life and death balanced on the edge of a decision. "Come on, girl," he said. She needed no further invitation. The wind howled as John drove through the snow-laden forest roads. Trees loomed on either side, their skeletal branches casting long, shifting shadows under the moonlight. The news unsettled him. A mother bear wouldn't just abandon her cubs, not unless something had gone terribly wrong. Poaching was an ugly reality, even with protections in place. The thought of it gnawed at him, making his grip on the wheel tighten. As he neared the reserve, the familiar wooden sign loomed ahead, dusted with snow. A figure stood waiting near the gate, bundled in a heavy coat. Sarah Thompson, the head caretaker, waved him down as he pulled in. "They're inside," she said the moment he stepped out, her breath forming puffs in the freezing air. "We found them huddled near the old den site. No tracks from the mother anywhere." Her expression was grim. John nodded, following her through the narrow path leading to the reserve's infirmary. Inside, the warmth hit him immediately, but his focus was drawn to the three tiny forms nestled together in a crate lined with blankets. They were small, too small to be without a mother. Their fur was damp from melted snow, their tiny bodies shivering despite the heat of the room. One let out a weak, pitiful cry. "They're barely 2 months old," Sarah murmured. "We gave them fluids, but they won't eat. They need a mother, John." His jaw tightened. "If we don't find a way to keep them warm and fed, they won't last." A soft movement at his side made him glance down. Bella had walked up to the crate, her amber eyes locked onto the cubs. Slowly, she stepped closer, sniffing the air around them. The cubs shifted at her presence, their tiny noses twitching as if sensing something familiar. John exchanged a look with Sarah. "Let's see what she does." Bella, ever gentle, lowered herself to the floor, her body a steady, warm presence beside the crate. One of the cubs, the smallest of the three, let out another cry and, as if by instinct, stretched toward Bella. A deep, unspoken understanding passed between them. Bella didn't move away. Instead, she lowered her head, letting the tiny cub nuzzle against the soft fur of her neck. John's breath caught. He had seen dogs care for orphaned animals before, but never with bears. This wasn't just curiosity. This was something deeper, something primal. The other two cubs hesitated, but the warmth Bella offered was too inviting to ignore. They too edged closer, their weak movements driven by survival. Bella responded by curling slightly, her body forming a cocoon around them. John stepped back, watching as the cubs, for the first time since their rescue, began to settle. "We might have just found their surrogate," he murmured. Sarah exhaled, her relief evident. If she can keep them warm and calm, they have a fighting chance. John crouched beside Bella, running a hand through her thick fur. "Good girl," he whispered. She flicked her tail in response, her focus entirely on her new charges. As the night deepened, John and Sarah worked in quiet efficiency, ensuring the cubs had proper hydration and monitoring their vitals. But it was Bella who did the most important work. Her presence kept the cubs from slipping too far into the cold grasp of exhaustion. Hours passed, and when John finally leaned back, exhaustion weighing on his shoulders, he found himself staring at the remarkable sight before him. Bella, curled around 3 tiny bear cubs, as if she had always been meant for this role. John had spent years rescuing animals, seeing both the cruelty and kindness of the world. But watching Bella, he was reminded of something simple yet profound. Love, in its purest form, knew no species. And tonight, it just might be the thing that saved these cubs. John woke to the soft sounds of breathing, deep and steady from Bella, lighter and uneven from the cubs. The infirmary was bathed in the dim glow of the overhead light, casting gentle shadows over the scene before him. He had fallen asleep in the chair, arms crossed over his chest, but his body was stiff now, his back aching from the awkward position. He barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on Bella, still curled protectively around the 3 bear cubs, her body a golden shield against the cold that threatened to take them. The smallest cub, the one that had first reached for her, was tucked into the curve of her belly, its tiny paws twitching as it dreamed. The other 2 were sprawled beside her, their fur rising and falling in shallow breaths. But they were breathing, and for now that was enough. Sarah entered quietly, bouncing 2 cups of coffee in her gloved hands. "You didn't move all night," she murmured, setting one beside him. "Didn't want to." His voice was rough with sleep, but his gaze never left Bella and the cubs. "They're still here." He hadn't meant for it to sound so heavy, but it did. Sarah understood. In their line of work, too many mornings had begun with empty blankets, bodies gone still in the night, warmth stolen by something far more ruthless than the cold. This time, though, they had defied the odds, at least for now. Sarah crouched beside Bella, watching the steady rhythm of the cubs' breathing. "I still can't believe this," she whispered. "It's not just that they're taking to her. She's taking to them." Bella stirred at the sound of Sarah's voice, blinking up at them with tired but watchful eyes. She didn't move, didn't break the fragile cocoon she had created around the cubs. John reached out, running his fingers lightly over Bella's fur, feeling the warmth that radiated from her body. She had always been gentle, but this was something deeper, something instinctual. A mother without pups had found 3 orphans without a mother, and somehow it had become something whole. "She won't leave them," John said, half to himself. "Not until they're ready." Sarah let out a slow breath. "Then we have to make sure she has everything she needs to do this." She stood, already shifting into planning mode. "We'll need a better setup. If she's going to stay with them, we have to keep them somewhere safer than this crate." John nodded. The recovery pen, bigger space, controlled heat, softer flooring. He was already calculating, considering every possible factor. "We'll move them after their next feeding." He glanced at the clock. "They're due soon." As if on cue, one of the cubs let out a weak whimper. Bella lifted her head slightly, her ears twitching. She didn't seem panicked, only aware, as if she understood the cub's needs as well as if they were her own. John moved swiftly, preparing the formula they had formulated to mimic the mother bear's milk as closely as possible. Feeding orphan cubs was always a delicate process. Too much, too fast, and their fragile stomachs wouldn't handle it. Too little, and they wouldn't survive. He cradled the smallest cub first, guiding the bottle's nipple to its mouth. The cub resisted at first, instinct searching for its mother, but as the warm liquid touched its lips, it latched on with tiny, desperate pulls. Bella watched intently, her head tilting slightly, as if memorizing the process. One by one, they fed the cubs, patience guiding their hands, relief settling in with each tiny swallow. The strength in them was faint but present. They were fighting. That was all John needed to keep going. Once the feeding was done, the move began. John and Sarah worked carefully, lifting the entire blanket Bella and the cubs lay on, rather than disturbing their nest. Bella rose slightly, following them without hesitation as they transferred her small family into the larger recovery pen. The space was warmer, lined with thick bedding and enclosed to mimic the safety of a den. The moment they settled, Bella did the same. She circled twice, then curled around the cubs, pressing them into the warmth of her body. It was so seamless, so natural, that it nearly took John's breath away. Over the next few days, the routine set in. The cubs fed every few hours, their bodies slowly filling out, their cries becoming stronger. Bella remained a constant presence, grooming them gently with her tongue, nudging them when they whimpered, tucking them closer when they shivered. She never left their side, not even when John called her name. By the third day, the change in the cubs was unmistakable. Their fur no longer clung damply to their small frames. Their movements, though still clumsy, held more strength. They began to respond to Bella's touch, to burrow into her rather than simply exist beside her. It was a fragile victory, but a victory nonetheless. John found himself watching more than he worked, lingering at the edge of the pen as Bella tended to her new charges. He had spent years studying animal behavior, rescuing creatures abandoned by their own kind. But this was something he had never seen before. It wasn't just survival, it was something more. One evening, as the sky darkened outside the reserve, Sarah leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You should go home," she said. "Get some real sleep." John shook his head, still staring at Bella and the cubs. "Not yet." Sarah sighed but didn't push. She knew him too well. "They're going to be okay, you know," she said after a moment. "Because of her." John nodded slowly. "Yeah," he murmured. "I know." But even as the words left his mouth, he felt the weight of the unspoken truth settle in his chest. They wouldn't stay like this forever. The cubs were growing, and as they grew, so would their instincts. One day, sooner than he wanted to admit, they would have to leave Bella behind, and he wasn't sure if either of them was ready for that. The first snowfall of the season came in the quiet of the early morning, drifting in soft, soundless sheets outside the reserve's windows. The world beyond the glass was painted in white, the trees outlined in frost, the sky a heavy, muted gray. Inside the recovery pen, the warmth of the heating lamps cast a golden glow over the thick bedding where Bella lay curled around her cubs. Their tiny bodies were no longer so fragile, their fur fluffed with new strength, their eyes brighter. They had grown in just a week, their movements less hesitant, their cries less desperate. The smallest one, who had first reached for Bella, was the boldest now, climbing clumsily over her back, tumbling down onto his siblings, letting out tiny huffs of frustration when they nudged him away. Bella was endlessly patient, her soft eyes following their every move, her body adjusting each time they shifted, always making room for them. It was as if she had been meant for this, as if something in her heart had been waiting for a chance to mother again. John leaned against the doorway, watching them, a cup of coffee warming his hands. His exhaustion hadn't faded, but it had settled, turning into something quieter. The weight in his chest, the one that had pressed down on him the night he found the cubs, had loosened. They were surviving. More than that, they were beginning to live. Sarah walked up beside him, stretching out her stiff arms. "They look good," she murmured. "A week ago, I wasn't sure they'd make it." John nodded, his eyes still on Bella. "She did this," he said. "I don't think they would have made it without her." Sarah exhaled, shaking her head. "I've seen a lot in this job, but never this. She's not just helping them. She's raising them." John knew it too. The bond between them had deepened. Something beyond instinct, something beyond survival. Bella had given them more than warmth. She had given them comfort, security, something even the best human caretakers couldn't replicate. But he also knew what was coming. They weren't meant to stay here. The cubs were growing. Their instincts were waking up, pulling them towards something beyond the soft bedding and enclosed pen. It was in the way they sniffed the air when the wind carried the scent of pine through the open doors, the way they swiped at each other with clumsy, oversized paws, testing their strength, learning the language of their kind, and it was only a matter of time before they began to outgrow what Bella could give them. "They're going to need more space," Sarah said, echoing his thoughts. John drained the last of his coffee, nodding. "I'll set up the transition enclosure this afternoon. We'll start moving them tomorrow." Sarah hesitated, her voice lowering. "And Bella?" John exhaled slowly, setting his empty mug on the counter. "She'll have to let them go." Neither of them spoke after that, the silence settling thick around them. The transition started the next morning. The cubs were taken one at a time, carried gently into the larger outdoor enclosure, an enclosed piece of forest meant to introduce them to the world they would one day call home. The ground was layered with fallen leaves, the air crisp with the scent of damp earth and distant water. The trees stretched high, their branches still dusted with snow, the faint calls of birds weaving through the space. The cubs hesitated at first, their noses twitching, their small bodies pressing against the familiar warmth of John's jacket. But when they were set down, when their paws touched the earth, something changed. The smallest one moved first, stepping forward with cautious, wobbling steps. He sniffed at the leaves, nudging them with his nose, then took another step, then another. The second cub followed, drawn by his siblings' movement. The third hung back the longest, staring at the open space, then at John, then back at the ground. Finally, he too took his first step forward. Bella was watching from the other side of the enclosure wall, her ears perked, her body tense. John had left the door open, allowing her to enter if she wanted to, but she hadn't moved. Her eyes were locked on the cubs, watching as they ventured further into the space, their small bodies disappearing briefly behind the brush before reappearing, their steps growing steadier. Then finally she moved. Slowly, cautiously, she stepped through the open gate. The moment she did, the cubs turned, their noses lifting, their bodies pivoting toward her. The smallest one rushed back first, pressing his face into her fur, whining softly. The others followed, gathering around her, their small paws pressing against her chest, their noses searching for reassurance. Bella licked each of them in turn, sniffing their fur, as if making sure they were still hers. Then, with the same patience she had always shown, she sat down, letting them climb over her, letting them tangle themselves in her warmth. John's throat tightened. She was letting them go, but not yet, not today. For now, they were still hers. Over the next week, the cubs began to spend more time in the enclosure, their movements becoming more confident, their instincts sharpening. They climbed low branches, wrestled with each other, tested their growing strength. Bella watched them from the sidelines, sometimes following, sometimes stepping back, always present. But John could see the change in her. She was starting to understand. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting golden light across the snow, John walked to the enclosure, hands in his pockets. Bella sat just outside the gate, her eyes on the cubs as they played. She didn't move when he crouched beside her, didn't take her eyes off them. "You did good," he murmured, running his hand through her fur. Bella let out a slow breath, her body relaxing under his touch. John swallowed hard. "They'll be ready soon." Bella didn't react, but he knew she understood. The cubs would stay in the enclosure for another month, growing stronger, learning from each other until the day came when the gates would open to the wild, when they would take the final step forward, the one Bella couldn't take with them. And when that day came, John didn't know what it would mean for her. For now, though, she was still their mother, and for now, they were still hers. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine as the sun rose over the reserve, bathing the trees in a golden glow. The world beyond the enclosure was waking, birds stirring in the branches, the faint rustle of unseen creatures moving through the underbrush. But inside the enclosure, it was already alive with movement. The cubs had changed. In just a few short weeks, their tiny, frail bodies had transformed, their legs stronger, their steps surer. They no longer stumbled when they walked, they prowled. No longer whimpered when they played, they wrestled. Their instincts were sharpening, their natural wildness emerging. John watched from his usual spot near the fence, his arms folded across his chest, his breath misting in the morning cold. He had seen this transformation before, had spent years helping young animals transition from dependence to independence. But this time was different. This time, there was Bella. She sat in the middle of the enclosure, her golden fur standing out against the earthy tones of the forest floor. The cubs circled her like satellites, moving in and out of her space, testing the boundaries between the world they had known and the world they were learning to belong to. The smallest one, the boldest one, was the first to stray, his nose lifting to the wind, his body following an invisible pull that had nothing to do with Bella and everything to do with what lay beyond. He sniffed the ground, pawed at the leaves, took a few cautious steps toward the far end of the enclosure, where the trees thickened, where the scent of freedom was strongest. Bella watched him go but didn't move to stop him. The other two hesitated, glancing between their sibling and Bella, their instincts warring with their attachment. The second cub followed, his steps slower, more uncertain. The last cub remained pressed against Bella's side for a moment longer, then with a soft huff, stepped forward. John let out a slow breath. This was it, the beginning of the real separation. He had seen it coming, had known it was inevitable. But still, something in his chest tightened as he watched the cubs explore, without seeking Bella's reassurance. She remained where she was, her ears twitching, her gaze locked onto them, but she made no move to call them back. John knew she wouldn't. She understood now. They weren't hers to keep. Sarah approached from behind, stopping beside him. They're pulling away, she murmured. John nodded. They have to. And Bella? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. She's letting them. For the next few days, the cubs ventured further, returning to Bella less and less. They played rougher, climbed higher, learned to use their claws, their teeth. They were preparing themselves for the life they were meant to have. But it wasn't just the cubs changing. Bella was too. She still watched over them, still lingered near, but her presence had shifted. Where she had once curled around them, she now sat beside them. Where she had once called them back with a gentle nudge, she now let them go without protest. It was subtle, but John saw it. Then came the morning when everything truly changed. John arrived at the enclosure as usual, steaming coffee in hand, expecting to see the cubs playing near Bella. But they weren't. Instead, they were at the far end of the enclosure, gathered near the fence, their noses pressed to the wire, their bodies tense with anticipation. They had heard something, smelled something, something beyond the walls of their temporary home. Bella was not with them. John's stomach tightened as he scanned the enclosure, searching for her. She wasn't in her usual spot beneath the trees, wasn't near the den they had made. And then he saw her. She was standing by the open gate. His breath caught. The gate wasn't open fully, just slightly ajar, enough for Bella to have nudged it, enough for her to step out if she chose to. But she hadn't. Not yet. She stood frozen, torn between two worlds. Behind her, the cubs chuffed softly, their eyes flicking between her and the open gate, sensing something shifting, but not yet understanding. John moved carefully, stepping closer, his voice low. Bella? She turned her head, just slightly, her amber eyes meeting his, and he understood. She was waiting, not for him, not for the cubs, but for permission. John swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the fence. He could stop her. He could close the gate, call her back, convince himself that she belonged here with him. But that would be a lie. Bella had given everything to these cubs. She had nurtured them, taught them, protected them, and now she was ready to let them go. The question was he? John's throat was tight as he exhaled slowly, then reached for the gate. He didn't call her name again, didn't give a command. Instead, he stepped back, giving her space. Bella turned fully toward him now, her body tense, her eyes searching his. He nodded once, and she understood. With one last glance at the cubs, she stepped forward, through the gate, into the wild. The cubs let out soft, uncertain noises, their bodies shifting toward her. But Bella didn't stop. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look back. John watched as she moved through the trees, her golden fur catching the morning light, her silhouette disappearing between the trunks until she was gone. The silence that followed was heavy. Sarah let out a shaky breath. She left. John nodded, his jaw tight. She did. And it was right. It didn't make it easier. The cubs lingered by the gate for a long time, staring after her, their small bodies still filled with the instinct to follow. But as the hours passed, they began to settle. They played, they wrestled, they explored. And when the sun began to set, they didn't look toward the gate anymore. That night, as John sat by the fire in his cabin, Bella's absence weighed on him. He had spent years training himself not to grow attached to the animals he helped, had built walls around his heart to keep from feeling the sting of every release, every goodbye. But Bella had slipped past those walls like it had never been a choice. He stared into the flames, memories flickering through his mind. The first night she curled around the cubs, the way she had watched them grow, the way she had let them go. She had done what no one had asked of her, what no one had expected, and now she was where she belonged. John leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. Wherever she was, he hoped she knew. She had been loved. The world felt different without Bella. John had known it would. He had prepared himself for it, had told himself over and over again that she had done what she was meant to do, that she had made her choice. But still, in the quiet moments, when he poured his coffee in the morning, when he walked the familiar paths of the reserve, when he glanced toward the enclosure expecting to see her golden fur glowing in the sunlight, her absence pressed against him like a weight. The cubs were adjusting faster than he was. They no longer waited by the gate, no longer looked for her when they played. Their instincts had taken over, guiding them toward the independence they were meant for. They were growing fast now, their bodies stronger, their movements sharper. Soon they would be ready for full release. That was the plan, the inevitable next step. And yet John found himself hesitating. Sarah noticed. She always did. "You're stalling," she said one afternoon, leaning against the fence as they watched the cubs. They were wrestling near the tree line, tumbling over one another with a kind of joyful wildness that made it clear they weren't meant to stay here much longer. "They're ready, John. They need to go." He exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. "I know." Sarah didn't say anything for a long moment, just watched him. Then softer, she said, "Are you?" John let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "I should be." She didn't push him further, didn't press for more than he was willing to give. She just nodded, understanding in her eyes. But John knew the truth. It wasn't just about the cubs. It was about Bella. It had been a month since she had walked through that gate, and there hadn't been a single sign of her since. He told himself that was a good thing. It meant she had moved on, that she was surviving. But still, doubt clawed at the edges of his mind. He had seen too many animals struggle, too many creatures return broken, lost. What if she hadn't made it? What if she had given up everything, her home, her safety for those cubs, only to find herself alone in a world that didn't want her? The thought haunted him. Then one morning, everything changed. It was early, the sky still tinged with the soft hues of dawn. John was making his usual round through the reserve, checking the enclosures, ensuring everything was in place. The cubs were awake, playfully swiping at each other in the golden light, their thick fur rippling with every movement. He was about to turn away when he heard it. A bark, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't loud, wasn't urgent, just a soft, familiar sound carried by the wind. His heart pounded as he turned, scanning the trees, his pulse roaring in his ears. And then he saw her. Bella stood at the edge of the clearing, her golden fur dusted with dirt, her body leaner than before. But she was strong. Her eyes were bright, her stance steady. She was whole. John's chest tightened. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Bella took a step forward, and another. John dropped to one knee, his throat too tight to speak. "Bella." She hesitated for only a second before closing the distance between them, pressing her face into his chest, her body warm and solid against his. John let out a shaky breath, his fingers tangling in her fur. "You made it," he murmured. "You really made it." Bella let out a quiet huff, nuzzling against him before pulling back. There was something in her eyes, something new, something different. She wasn't just here to see him. She had come back for the cubs. John turned his head, following her gaze. The cubs had stopped playing. They were standing still, ears perked, eyes wide. For a long moment, they just stared. Then, as if some invisible thread had pulled them forward, they moved. The smallest one ran first. It wasn't like before, when they had climbed into her warmth, when they had curled against her for comfort. This was different. This was a reunion of equals. They reached her, brushing against her, sniffing, chuffing softly in recognition. Bella greeted them in return, nudging them, licking their faces, her body vibrating with energy. John could hardly breathe. Sarah had arrived at some point, standing beside him, her voice barely above a whisper. She came back. John nodded, unable to say anything else. They had thought she was gone for good, that she had made her choice. But now as he watched her move among them, something inside him shifted. She hadn't left them. She had just been waiting. For them to be ready. For all of them to be ready. The release happened 2 days later. The cubs had been ready for weeks. Their strength undeniable. Their instincts fully awakened. They had passed every test, had proven they could survive. But now with Bella there, the final step felt different. It felt right. John stood at the edge of the enclosure. The gate opened wide. The cubs hesitated only briefly, sniffing the air, sensing the freedom that awaited them. Then, one by one, they stepped through. Bella followed. John watched as they disappeared into the trees, their bodies blending with the wild, their movements seamless, effortless. He didn't call after them, didn't try to hold on. He just stood there, watching until they were gone. Sarah let out a slow breath beside him. Think we'll ever see her again? John's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. I think, he said quietly, that she'll always find her way back. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the forest, a golden retriever moved alongside the bears she had raised, no longer just their protector, no longer just their mother, but their equal, their family. The forest had a different rhythm now. The absence of the cubs and of Bella had left an emptiness in the reserve that John hadn't quite figured out how to fill. He told himself this was the way it was supposed to be. They had been raised to leave. It had always been temporary. And yet every morning when he made his rounds, every time he passed the enclosure that once held them, he felt that quiet ache of something unfinished, something left behind. He wondered where they were now, if they had made it through their first few nights, if they had found shelter when the rains came, if they had stayed together or if instinct had pulled them apart. He told himself not to dwell on it, but he did. Months passed. The reserve settled back into routine. New rescues came. Animals needed care. The world moved on, as it always did. But Bella did not return. John had half expected her to. She had left once before, but she had come back. This time was different. He told himself it was a good thing. She had found her place. She had become what she was meant to be. And yet he missed her. More than he had thought possible. One evening, as he sat on his cabin's porch, watching the last light fade from the sky, he heard it, a single distant bark. John's heart slammed against his ribs. He stood so fast that his chair nearly toppled over. His eyes scanned the tree line, the dark silhouettes of the forest stretching out in endless shadows. His ears strained against the silence, against the distant hum of crickets, against the wind rustling through the trees. He waited, hoping. Then, movement. A golden figure stepped from the shadows. Bella. John let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped inside him for months. He took a slow step forward, then another. Bella, he murmured, barely believing she was real. She moved toward him, her steps steady, her fur dusted with dirt and leaves. She was leaner, stronger. She had been living out there, really living, surviving the way she was meant to. And yet, as she reached him, pressing her head into his chest, she was still the same Bella, the same loyal, steady soul who had once curled around 3 orphan cubs and made them hers. John sank to his knee, his fingers tangling in her fur. You did it, he whispered. You really did it. She pulled back, and that's when he saw it, something different in her eyes. A quiet urgency, a purpose. She hadn't just come back to see him. She needed him. John stood, his pulse quickening. Show me. Bella turned, her body tense with energy, and took off toward the woods. John didn't hesitate. He grabbed a flashlight, barely pausing to shut the cabin door before following her into the trees. The forest was dark, the scent of damp leaves thick in the air. Bella moved fast but sure, weaving through the underbrush, her ears flicking back every so often to make sure he was keeping up. She led him deep into the reserve, farther than he had gone in months, until the trees opened up into a small clearing. And there, at the base of a fallen log, were 2 bear cubs. John's breath caught. They were smaller than the ones he had raised, barely old enough to be on their own. Their fur was thick, their eyes wide with fear. They were pressed together, their tiny bodies trembling, their noses twitching at Bella's scent. Orphaned, alone, just like before. John took a slow step forward, careful not to startle them. The cubs didn't move, their eyes darting between him and Bella. And Bella, she was watching them with that same quiet patience, the same understanding she had once shown the others. John knelt beside her, his voice soft. "You found them, didn't you?" Bella didn't react, just kept her eyes on the cubs. John exhaled. She hadn't just survived out here. She had kept watch. She had stayed near the bears she had raised, had followed their movements, had learned their ways. And when she had found these two, alone, abandoned, she had done the only thing she knew how to do. She had come back for help. John felt a lump rise in his throat. He had thought her story was over, that she had walked away for good. But she had never truly left, and she never would. The cubs let out small, uncertain sounds. They were hungry, weak, but they were still strong enough to fight, to survive, if given a chance. John reached for his radio, his voice steady as he called for Sarah. "I need transport to the north clearing. 2 cubs, orphans." A crackle of static. Then her voice came through. "You serious?" "Very." A pause, then, "On my way." John lowered the radio and turned back to Bella. She was still watching the cubs, her body relaxed but alert, as if she knew this was just the beginning. John reached out, ran a hand over her head, his voice quiet. "Looks like we've got work to do." Bella exhaled softly, then without hesitation, lay down beside the cubs, curling around them just like she had before. The cubs, uncertain but drawn to her warmth, inched closer, their tiny bodies pressing against her side. John swallowed hard. This was who she was. Not just a dog, not just a survivor. She was a guardian. And as the stars glittered above them, as the night wrapped around them like a promise, John knew the truth. Bella's story wasn't over. It was only just beginning. This story is a testament to the power of love, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds that transcend species. Bella's journey wasn't just about survival, it was about purpose. She proved that family isn't defined by blood, but by the connections we choose to nurture. Through her unwavering devotion, she saved not just one set of cubs, but continued to protect those in need, showing us that compassion has no limits. In life, we often face moments where we must let go, trust the path ahead, and believe that the love we give will leave a lasting impact. Bella's story reminds us that even when we think our role is over, life has a way of calling us back to serve in ways we never expected. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you stories of hope, resilience, and the extraordinary bond between humans and animals. Stay tuned for more inspiring tales, and remember, kindness changes lives. See you in the next story.